So yes, I'm going to talk about the application of system thinking to enterprise design. I'm going to explain what enterprise design is. Basically, I'm going to talk a bit about me, but very little, only in the context of the talk. And then I'm going to talk specifically about business architecture, which is part of enterprise design, what it is and where does it come from. And then the application of systems thinking to enterprise design, and hopefully end with an open discussion about how we sort of extend the application of systems thinking within organizations as part of business architecture and enterprise design practice. The emphasis is on applied system thinking and how we can make it land really in organizations. My time, 30 years, is it's difficult in service organizations, and I'll explain why as we go through. So a bit about me. I started life off as an electronic engineer, technician. I spent a lot of time in one of these, also one of these, and in this sort of environment. And that sort of, so you've got a Faraday cage, because I worked in radar systems and environmental chamber and clean air room. And this obviously gave me a big appreciation for the environment and its impact on systems, in this case, radar systems. And I did spend an awful lot of time being very cold and then very hot, testing radar systems and applying something called worst case design. The law of auxiliarity to electronics, where basically the electronics needs to be able to operate over temperature range. So that gave me an initial very good appreciation of systems thinking, which I really got into as when I moved into IT and did an MBA and started looking at operations design many years later. Back to my radar background, spent a lot of time on Dungeness Beach in this building, which was a Marconi test station. Sadly, no longer there. It's been pulled down and a house has been put in its place. But we were using it for radar testing on Dungeness Beach. And I spent a lot of time walking around the beach with a weather balloon attached to my arm as we tested the systems. And we worked on radar systems that were replacing these sort of old style rotating screen and bringing in TV-based raster scan-based radar screens. First ones in the world. I worked on the first one, which was for small boat radars. Yeah, a few years later, the sad Marconi building was looking very sad, and indeed now it's been completely pulled down. So I say my background is electronic engineering. So you could argue that my input into systems thinking was very much more around systems engineering and system dynamics, but actually I broadened it out from that quite quickly. Few favourite sayings. I'm a big fan of theory-based practice rather than just practice without any theory, which unfortunately in my field is quite common, and I'll go into that a bit. And it's the use of structured methods. And again, I walk into many transformation project and look around for the structured methods and can't really see any. And that's been the story for the 30 years. And also how important it is to make things simple rather than complicated. Too much complexity by man design as opposed to simple solutions. So let's say a little bit about me to set the context. Business architecture. So what is it and where did it come from? It's basically a discipline that creates a blueprint for enterprise, its structure and operations. So it's similar to a building architect. So we look at the structure and we focus on the structure rather than the detail within the operation. It provides the framework, the scaffolding, as some people refer to it as. And it connects strategy, goals and objectives to the design of the operation. Quite often you have strategy and you have the operation, and they're quite often not particularly well connected. And for example, you have large business change programs, and you can walk in and look at that change program and say, to what extent is that delivering the strategy? And it's difficult to see how it is. Someone had a good idea that let's have this program, let's have this project, quite independent of the strategy, current strategy of the organization. And I've done assessments where people have asked me to come in and look at a program and say, to what extent is this delivering the strategy? And I've discovered that it's not really, and I've had programs and projects stopped because basically it wasn't consistent with the strategy that they wanted to pursue. So that's basically business architecture. It's from strategy to execution, as it's sometimes expressed. And business architecture is part of the wider discipline of enterprise design, which takes you deeper and wider in the sense of you've got your structure, then you're designing your services and processes, you're designing your customer experience, you're designing the organization, the people side of things, both the structure, but also the soft aspects of the organization, the culture, etc. And the locations and technology, basically all aspects of the operating model, the design of which is encompassed within the term enterprise design. I'm going to focus quite a bit on business architecture side of things, but I will also touch service design, process design, in terms of my application of systems thinking. So we represent the operation through visualizations, diagrams, and associated data. And those elements are something called value streams, which sort of shows the end-to-end customer journey and how we're delivering value to the customer. So that customer journey is, for example, when they want to travel, they need to know how they can travel, when they can travel, then they make the journey, and after they've made the journey, there may be some other parts of the customer journey. For example, they lost something on the bus and they need to retrieve it. So that's the sort of customer journey for what I currently work on, which is bus services, not dissimilar to rail services that we were discussing earlier on. And then you've got the services that actually are delivered to support that value stream. So travel information, updates travel information as you're traveling to know whether you're going to get delayed. So individual services that are supporting the customer journey, the value stream. And then for those services, well, what capabilities do we need? What do we need to be able to? What do we need to be good at? So that's where we model the business capabilities. And that's a whole field in its own, and there's an awful lot of confusion around business capabilities because you have different methods and techniques that are applied. But in the transport context, so the ability to create an integrated transport network, deliver transport services, provide travel information, passenger assistance for people with mobility issues, and back to lost property, the ability to find and return someone's lost property and look after it while it's in your possession. Then the next area is organizational structure, how the enterprise organizes itself, structures itself, both formally and informally. In the end, enterprises are social activity systems, and the social aspect of an enterprise is extremely important. And the final one is location, so where things are located geographically. So, for example, where we place bus stations, transport interchanges, whether people are working remote or on site or hybrid, so how people are working, where they are working, what facilities they need. So they're the main dimensions. There can be others, but they're the principal ones. So where did it come from? It's actually evolved from sort of two different separate strands, streams. One based on the design of the enterprise, which is basically where I come from, and the other is based on the design of IT. Now, anyone who works in the IT world will know that they're quite insular and they come up with their own ideas. So we've ended up with these sort of two separate streams around business architecture, which I'll just describe now. So design of the enterprise and target operating models. So this path originated from business management theory and practice. It's rooted in strategy, operations, and organizational behavior. The focus is on how we align strategy with the operational execution, and how we develop dynamic target operating models and transition roadmaps. So we have an idea of where we want the operation to get to and how we're going to get there. And it's typically used by business leaders and consultancies. So the big consultancies, Deloitte, people like that, are very versed in developing target operating models and using business architecture in that context to guide business transformation, align resources and capabilities around the strategy, and as a means of improving the operational productivity of the business. But then we have, so the chronological order of that. Now, this is very much based around my chronological order in terms of development of my business architecture practice. Someone else might have a different set of key events, but as I say, mine was very much based on management theory as it is. So you've got the theory of the growth of the firm, Edith Penrose in 1959 is a key marker. You've got all the system thinking sort of ideas coming in, viable system model, obviously, the law of associativity. You've got the resource-based view of the firm, which I'll talk a bit about alongside systems thinking practice. Things like the balanced scorecard for performance management and so forth. And particularly for me, something called CSE Catalyst, which I will talk a bit about, which was a business engineering framework, which I used back in the 1990s. And that had an element of systems thinking within it, but it was sort of more around the sort of system dynamics school, as the word engineering would sort of indicate. But basically, that's the sort of chronological order for that strand. But then we have the world of IT. Now, this is more rooted in IT enterprise architecture and IT planning, and it's heavily sort of influenced by frameworks such as TOGAF. I don't know if you know TOGAF, but basically it's an enterprise architecture framework, design framework. It's the principal one today. There are others, but that's the main one. And its lens is that to design the IT, we need to understand the business. We need to understand the business architecture. And so business architecture is purely there to serve IT design and development, and very little else. And that's created, a different approach in terms of business architecture. And its sort of chronological history is, say, more founded on sort of information system planning and IT architectural frameworks like Zachman and TOGAF. And more recently, you've got the Business Architecture Guild developing the business architecture side of this strand. And they would probably argue that they're much more business focused than IT focused, but I am made to be convinced. But that's So that's the strand. But the one I'm going to focus on, and certainly in terms of my practice over the last 30 years, is the first one. But I thought I would say when you're out there and people are talking maybe about business architecture and enterprise design to you, they may be coming from the IT world, which has an incredible capability to ignore the rest of the world. So you mentioned certain management theories to them, and they just look at you blankly, and it doesn't exist within their universe. And unless it's come from their universe, it literally doesn't exist. So yes, just in case you encounter a few IT world people. So key influences from a systems thinking perspective. Now, for me, systems thinking has always been there as an underpinning thing. It's not something I go into an organization and start talking about. I use it almost in guerrilla mode to a large extent. And that's been my practice because of the maturity of the organizations that I typically work in. And the issue there in service organizations is people, they get trained in their technical field, running railways, for example, or buses, but they get no training in service operations management, as it's called. So it's really difficult going into a service organization and talking about designing services, designing operating models. So you have to adopt a certain approach that allows things to land and allows you to progress. And that certainly applies to systems thinking. But the first thing I'm going to cover is idealized design, which I say most of the people. I'm not going to get everyone on the call on the meeting will know more about system thinking than me. That's something I would say. So I'm not going to go deeply into the systems thinking topic, but I'm going to say what the relationship is to enterprise design practice. And you can see that when we talk about target operating models, all that's idealized design, and indeed it is, certainly in my world. I've never quite seen that link written down on documentation around target operating models, but it is idealized design from Ross, without doubt, because basically you're creating this target and you're ignoring constraints, and you're then working out how you're going to achieve that target. And that is fundamental part of enterprise design and business architecture. And the other thing to emphasize that when we talk about target operating models, they're not static, they're dynamic, because essentially, as soon as you start implementing the model, the system changes and the external environment will have changed because time has moved on. So basically, you're constantly updating your target as part of the process. So idealized design is something that's always sort of, I say, been there as my foundation, if you like, but it will be talked about in the context of target operating modeling. And we have, I mean, this is my own design framework, but basically it's back to what I was saying earlier, that you basically are linking strategy to your operation design. So you've got a strategy and business model, and you translate that into a set of business capabilities, the abilities that you need to be good at to deliver your strategy. And those abilities then have to be realized through the operations that you have. And as I say, they are structured, represented as a set of activities, value streams, services, and processes, and then the different domains around those in terms of people, location, data, technology. And we basically look at the current state and the future state and then do a gap analysis to construct a transition roadmap. So idealized design for Ross is translated into this sort of realization and approach. The law of reciprocity. So this plays a big part in that when we're designing the enterprise, we need to make sure that it can actually absorb and respond to the demand on the enterprise. So we focus on, also I certainly do, in the old days, people would design processes and produce work instructions, and everything would be heavily controlled in terms of what someone can do. And that can be fine in manufacturing, but not great in services, because the variation of demand of a service can be where it's down to individuals and their individual needs. So it can be significant. So you've got to be able to absorb that demand. I have the variety to respond, and you've got to provide data that allows you to make decisions across that range of demand. And it also means that when we're designing operations, that we have to be very careful with automation. You've got the computer says no scenario, where just because you can doesn't mean you should, because you can automate something, and automation often requires the definition of very fixed business rules, and you then fail to be able to respond to the variety that your operation is facing. So it plays a big part in terms of my thinking when I'm in there designing the enterprise. And that's particularly when we're working on relational services. So we were talking about the health service earlier on. Health service is basically a relational service type service. So basically you have a relationship with a patient. It's not purely transactional, but unfortunately sometimes it is executed as a pure transactional service. GPs are particularly now bad at this, where basically they're treating it almost like a transactional 10-minute service, and not a relational one. Unlike when I was a child, we had our family doctor, and that was a relational service, not a transactional one. So there's more talk about this now, in the realization that services that are relational have become transactional, and they're not. I designed passport service many years ago, and that is basically transactional in the sense of you want a passport or you want to renew your passport. So that's fine. You've got very limited degree of variation in that. So you can design on that basis. You can automate, etc., but not health services or social care, etc. Constraints. Again, this is mainly Ashby, but others. Dave Snowden is very big on constraints, concept of constraints. So when we're designing services, we think about the constraints that apply. And they're generally defined as two types: governing constraints. So these are that limit behavior. So the need to conform to legislation, regulations, policies, use of standards, and strategic design decisions that have been made that then constrain the design of the service. And then you have enabling constraints that actually expand the possibilities. And that can be legislation, as in my current example, where the bus franchising legislation in the UK is allowing us to move away from the extremely broken, I've lost the word, the deregulated bus service system in the UK, other than in London, to an integrated and publicly run bus service in the UK. So that's a previous limiting constraint that's been removed, and an enabling constraint has been constructed for the legislation that's been put in place. So that's an example of enabling constraints. So again, as I say, when we're designing services and processes, constraints, and the consideration of constraints plays an important part to actually reduce the amount of variation that we have to handle in certain instances. And of course, Ashby used the traffic light example in the sense of we have 3 colours, not 5. 3 colours makes life simpler. Prosewid, the Percival system is what it does. Now, recently, so years ago, this was not talked about very much in the general world, but it seems to have become, certainly on LinkedIn, more prone to discussion. but it seems to get misunderstood. For me, it's just saying that, observe the behavior. Don't listen to what people are telling you what the system should be doing. So, I mean, the health service is a classic case of that today, where if you look at the NHS and you observe what it's doing, it's certainly not doing what anyone tells you it should be doing. That is key when I walk into an enterprise and into a transformation program. It's about observation. It's not about what people are telling you. It's the old lean thinking principle. Walk the floor. Go down to the factory floor. Don't listen to the managers. And the managers should be going down to the factory floor to see what really is going on. And so that it encourages a more holistic view. As I say, it encourages observation. Promotes the examination of unintended consequences and hidden functions. So what's really going on here? Those sort of questions. Yeah, and it helps you listen to the intended purposes and then align the system with a designer system which is actually delivering them, rather than where the actual outcomes do align with those stated purposes. So it plays in quite well. And yes, obviously, a viable system model. Basically, that is fundamentally about the design of enterprises. And again, I don't use it directly. I think if I went in and used it directly, again, I would have acceptance problems because of the level of design thinking in enterprises. But certainly, it forms a background in terms of how I think about the organization, in terms of its 5 systems and how they interact, and helps me, explore things like over-centralization, or to what degree we should have things centralized and decentralized, and the balance between, control and autonomy within the operation. Yes, and again, also about the ability of the enterprise to adapt to change. Both sudden change, so in terms of business continuity planning and disaster recovery, and longer term change in terms of ability to adapt to the market and so forth. I've included this for the handout in the sense of anyone on the call meeting who is not familiar. So that's system thinking. They're the main ones that sort of have influenced me and influenced my practice. Other key influences that I'm just going to touch on, because it's not just about systems thinking, but enterprise design and business architecture is about a few other things as well, for management theory. So the resource-based view of the firm, the development of strategy and the use of and the construction of a strategic architecture based on the capabilities that the business requires to deliver its strategy, and the resources that those capabilities require in terms of people, technology, processes, etc. And I always point people to this very old book, which is still very relevant and very good, which is Competing for the Future by Gary Hamel and C.K. Prakola. ISO 21010. So this influences our language. So we talk about architectural views. So that can be the service view, the process view, the people view, the location view, the technology view, and architectural descriptions built up of those views. And then architectural views, which are the individual sort of diagrams of representations of the viewpoints, and the models that they're constructed from. So that's another important part of enterprise design and business architecture. And yes, actually comes from the world of IT, because it originally developed for system software engineering, but then they realized that actually applies to all systems. And so they, in the latest standard version of this, they've sort of dropped the software engineering element and just focused on architectural descriptions for systems, and made it more complicated as well. Unfortunately, we're adding additional elements in extensions. So I always use this diagram because I think it's really simple and straightforward and easy to explain. And I talked about CSC Catalyst earlier on. That was very influential because I was the implementation manager at Siemens in the 90s. And then, as I say, I did a major business architecture, business transformation project for the UK Passport Service for 5 years, using this framework. And it introduced the concept of business design domains, and the concept of hard domains and soft domains. And you've got the engineering technical issues, and then you've got the psychology, human issues of an enterprise. And so this was very influential in terms of my practice. And I occasionally come across people who actually remember it. And I think it's still used in CSC today in its model form. And it introduced things like, so in the old days, people would design around the functions of the organization, the org chart, and still do, unfortunately. And they would design the processes based on the individual functions rather than the end-to-end value stream and services that are cross-functional. But CSC Catalyst introduced the process-oriented approach where basically looked across those functions and designed across those functions. And that was very successful at the UK Passport Service, adopting that approach. So, I'd say a brief tour and of systems thinking as I apply it to enterprise design. As I say, I'd like to sort of open it up to any questions, and also, discussing about how we can expand its use and get over some of the barriers. The principal one, as I say, is the lack of training in service organisations around design, and the difficulties that present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. It's definitely cleared up fogginess, or we say the murky box, around my understanding of enterprise design. Has anyone got any questions for Tim? We stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Oh, right.
Trying to get back to you at the moment. I've lost you. There we go. I'm back.
There you go. Right, while we sort this out, Patrick, you got
yeah, it's a sort of roundabout question in a way, Tim. So many years ago, we did a sort of group project in SCiO looking at a systemic approach to enterprise architecture, really, and came up with some what we thought was actually, something a lot easier and to do than to execute than the sort of typical TOGAFI type approaches.
Yes.
And of course, one of the big problems is that, a lot of enterprise architecture work that we were looking at, the enterprise changed faster than the architectural models did. So that basically they were always a long way out of date and trying to catch up. So they weren't doing architecture; they were just doing sort of recording of past history in a way.
Yeah.
But one of the things we found was that quite a few enterprise architects said they were interested in a completely different way of tackling this, but there was definitely we didn't really want that element to it, and as you've indicated, an unwillingness to engage with anything that didn't come out of their native industry. And I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about that as a more general issue, really, because I think you know, I don't think there are much easier ways of doing it than conventional enterprise architecture, and you know, some experience to show that. But getting
Yeah,
flex is a different thing, you know.
it's. I mean, people sort of say where it's changing, and enterprise architects, IT enterprise architects, are becoming less IT focused and becoming more rounded in terms of designing the enterprise. I have to say, I yet to see that in practice, and so not least sometimes in organisations they're called enterprise architects, but they're actually domain specialists.
Yeah.
So they understand the technology in a particular domain. They are not actually enterprise architects at all. So that makes it doubly difficult. I mean, this is where, you know, the theory and the conversations on LinkedIn and so forth fall away, because the reality on the ground is quite different. And as I say, you know, and I'm getting too old now, so I'm becoming a bit weary of walking into organizations, service organizations, and finding that all the people running the service, you've got 3,000 people and they've all worked out how to do it individually because they've had no training, and they've learned from the person next door about how to deliver a service. They might know about railways, but they don't know about service design. They don't know about service operations management. You know, I'm a great fan of the service operations management textbook from Warwick, and the Warwick SOM training. And I think, why isn't Warwick SOM training all over the country and all over the world? Why is there just still this little pocket of and of course with training, the reality is, and I saw some figures the other day, training has gone over a cliff in the last 30 years. The amount of training that used to take place in the 70s and 80s and 90s is far greater than the training that goes on in organizations today. No one gets trained in anything. It's very depressing. So as a business architect and enterprise designer, I walk in and I'm immediately told, you've got to make it more simple, a form that they can understand. And I go, yes, but to the extent that they require me to do that, all meaning is lost. So what do we do? And I know I'm an engineer, so you know there's probably people better at doing that than me, because I come from an engineering background, and you know, engineers have a certain way of thinking and operating. But still, I mean, you know, I've yet to, you know, how do you write the Janet and John book of enterprise design? I have no idea, Patrick. I don't. And Charles is on the call, and he can vouch for me on this entirely, because I've worked with Charles, and he knows my thoughts on this.
You're doing well, Tim. You're doing well, Tim.
It is a thing, though, isn't it? That, you know, what do they get? You know, what do they get us into to sort these sorts of things out? Is to deal with the complexity, and yet they won't allow you to deal with the complexity except, you know, behind the scenes. You know, you can't have a sensible conversation with lots of organizations about how do you actually want to deal with this, because they can't even talk about this because it's too scary.
So you're using VSM, for example, in the background. You're not exposing it because they would go, that's too theoretical, you know, or no, that's not practical.
I must admit, I did use VSM in BT, in global services, as part of its enterprise architecture. But it was never used, as you point out, it was never used up front. It was always, you know, there was a kind of underpinning structure, and I'd visualize things for them in a particular way. And to be honest, it's a bit like, you know, we saw the chat joke earlier about, you know, Fight Club and guerrilla versus guerrilla. Absolutely, it was you know, under there, because you couldn't go in and talk about any of the methodologies because they just were terrified of them, mostly because they were just ignorant of them, and therefore what they were ignorant of they were fearful of. But once actually they saw the design, they went, oh, that sort of makes sense. But I don't think we ever told them that we use VSM. They just got it and they went, oh yeah, that'll do, we can use that. But I think there was a bit of debate about it has to be simpler. Okay, in that case, so which products are you going to stop selling then? So if you want to make the way you've designed the organization and the way it functions and the process is simpler, then you'll have to just do less, because that's the only way you're actually ever going to make it simpler. And that a bit of that message got through, actually, about the fact that you cannot just you can't just compress or collapse complexity without stopping to do things that customers actually valued. It's a very difficult argument to have, that one.
It is, and it's also in terms of thinking with service organisations and thinking cross-functionally is always also very difficult. People generally return back to their function, their cosy little corner of the organisation. And so basically you try and get them to think, no, you're delivering services and it happens to someone owns that service and they've got delivery partners in the organisation and outside the organisation in terms of their strategic partners, and getting them to gear up for that and think in those terms. You may make some progress, but then it tends to fall away once you're out of the room and they all return back to their pigeonholes in the org chart and run their bit of the service. Yeah, so even if you make some progress during the business transformation project, honestly, if you come back 2 years later, you're going to find it's fallen away. In my experience.
I think, Tim, we've got a living experience with our last client, where just
you shouldn't go into too much detail in that, Charles. But yeah.
I know. We're not going too much detail, but I think it's very clear that there's one of the key things within the enterprise, the system thinking, but there's also the one thing of the after effects of our part through the organization. And in most places, after the architects have switched up the light, something new comes out from what we've done. And I think as architects, we have designers, architects, and thinkers. We need to think about the whole systematic view of the organization. And I think, Tony, I remember the time when you were in BT. I was in also BT. We still remember when we wanted to get 21st century. I'm sure you'll remember how we went through the pain of trying to design the 21st century network, and how each individual parts of BT to becoming BT one organization went through BT process, BT exact, BT worldwide, and all the pains we went through to actually deliver some form of capability that BT possesses today. But if you do, for those of us who were in BT at the time, at Astro Park, it was a crazy piece of time in the design of BT that it is today, because every single time something new happened, the organization couldn't flex enough. And that criticality was so complex that, at the time, if you remember, we also had the NHS contract, and that was another pain in the backside. So it still continues as we speak today.
Yeah. And I'm conscious Simon's got his hand up, but I think it's worth also saying that one of my feelings from this, Tim, about what you're talking about, none of the standard frameworks ever suits any business. Whether it's ETOM or TOGAF or APQC, none of the frameworks ever actually matches what you do in the business. Your business enterprise framework, whether it's your organizational structure, your processes, your IT, has to be unique to the business. That's just one of my takeouts from the whole darn thing.
Yes. Simon.
Hi, Tim and Charles. I am really interested in your presentation. And by the way, I started my life in Radar 2, and I finished my corporate life at Computer Sciences Corporation. Right?
Right.
And
You're going to snitch on me on the fact that I've used some of their copyright material.
Well, they don't exist anymore. They're DXC.
Well, no, that's true.
But and all of the half of the world's enterprise architects at CSC worked for me, right, in my role there.
Wow.
And there's, it always struck me that there's a huge gulf between the two types of enterprise architects you're talking about, the IT and the business ones. Huge gulf, right? But
Yes.
but the IT guys are always trying to chip away and take over what you guys do. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the play that they're undoubtedly trying to make now around AI and particularly big data and analytics, where they will claim that this gives them the rights to determine the way that organizations should be structured based upon a more deep insight into the way that IT is actually going to drive the enterprise. What's your view on that?
It's the push rather than the pull.
Yeah,
So my 30 years has lived in the world of push, IT push. Right? And I've spent 30 years saying, no, it's IT pull. So basically, we design the business and we pull technology in to enable that business. But the IT people really don't like that at all, because they want to be running things, essentially. They want to be at the center, not supporting. It's changed a bit. Some of the more recent projects I've worked on, they've recognized that the IT work stream is a supporting work stream, and it's supporting the business work streams that are designing the business. But most of my time, and also, again, to some extent, back to the lack of formal design of service operations, you've always had IT change programs because people sort of they recognize those more easily in the sense of we want to have this technology, so therefore we have a change program. If you say no, we need to redesign the operation, that lands less well and doesn't necessarily get the funding. So, but yeah, I mean, I go on about the IT world all the time, and them wanting to sort of be, sort of running things. And then you get
should we be
this
scared?
Sorry?
Should we be scared if they start to say, well, actually, this is all going to be done by AI and AI will do this and big data behind?
Well, that's why you can't have push. Push now becomes really dangerous because of AI. Really dangerous.
Yeah.
You need to. It's back to law of reciprocity. If you're pushing in AI and you're losing your ability to respond to demand, then you're breaking the business. And the trouble is, they break the business, then they realise they have, and then they revert back. But all the damage has been done. So, for example, I've worked on transformation projects where it's been the technology people say, oh, you can get rid of all these people. And they've got rid of all the people before they've actually implemented technology. Then they implement the technology and they don't see the productivity improvements, and they have to bring the worst people back again. So, and now that's now on steroids with AI. Really, really dangerous, the push rather than the pull. So businesses need to, they need to wise up really urgently and make sure that they're pulling AI into their business, not having it pushed by IT industry. But I mean, the IT industry is very strong. They're very powerful. So that's what you're seeing.
Thank you.
So yeah.
I think I mean, I'm a fellow of the British Computer Society. In our BCS enterprise architecture, I think there's a recognition that there needs to be that alignment needs to be much closer. And the separation between business and IT sense making actually is the similar and same sense making about the complexity. And to use Snowden, yes, it can be quite chaotic, it can be complex, but there are very certain frameworks that we could use, as you have shown in some of the work that you've done over the years and the work I've done with you over the years, show that organizations and that use a best of breed approach to this actually do outlive itself over the number of years. And I think it's very clear. I think, Simon's talked about the CSC. and Tony talked about BT as an example. We've talked about ETOM, and it's amazing that I've done quite a number of works. After working with Tim, I also worked in telco for an African firm called Globacom, which is a very large African firm that grew from 0 to 77 million customers. And it was so fast in terms of the complexity that every single time that we tried to take the next floor of growth, the systems that we had, processes we had, the functions we had, when you tried to use an ETOM model to it, it just broke down completely. And so what we started trying to do was to adapt the organization as we went along. So I love the comment in the chat where the gentleman said, you know, all models of enterprise architecture are wrong, but some are more useful than others. It's, you know, horses for courses. I love that statement, because actually, as Tim and I also found out in the last one we had, we went through this whole pain again of trying to get the organization to use an approach and to use a form of framework, but the system in itself churned it up in so many different ways that what you get as an end product, a team at one time got so frustrated.
Yeah,
Tim got so frustrated.
I mean, ETOM is. I mean, we need to make distinctions between frameworks. ETOM is very prescriptive. You know, it's a set of processes, set of services. TOGAF is just a framework for designing enterprise architecture. It's not prescriptive in that sense, other than in terms of method. But the comment about, you know, every framework has to be adapted to the particular situation that you're applying it in. You know, you can't just go in there and cookie cut with anything really. Which is why I like the VSM model so much, because as a thinking framework, because it's just getting you to think in terms of the 5 systems that exist in all organizations, and you know, the communication and feedback mechanisms. It's a light touch in a way, and that's why, you know, it should land so much easier, but it doesn't, you know, which I can never really understand. And I know the diagram, Stafford-Beer diagram, is frightening, but I mean, you can present that in a much simpler form. But even then, you know, you say, well, you've got the operations and you've got your coordination and so forth, you know, and it seems so obvious, but but still, no. People don't think about it in those terms. They think about they've got their org chart, they sit here, and you know, they do this, and they have a bag of activities that they do day in, day out. You know, and that's as far as the thinking goes, really, in many instances, sadly.
Great point.
It's a real challenge, that, I think, that the fact that some people simply will consciously or subconsciously accept that there is another level of organization that can be described than the org chart. They just don't want to play that game. They're like, you're just trying to complicate it. You know what I mean? It's you just can't get to first base sometimes with that conversation with some people in some moments, shall we say? Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
I think that's right, but I mean, what I've found works for, you know, I mean, working with VSM for like 30 years now with organizations is having a process is critical. You can't just stick a model in front of them and go, there you go, there, you know, let's just work through this. That absolutely doesn't work. You know, if you're doing design, if you've got a reasonably tight design process, and it's just like, now we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that, they can always follow that, you know, and they kind of get it without having to sort of do a brain transplant. You know, I mean, the brains have exploded by the end of the workshop, kind of thing, but you kind of got there, you know, and they're not the same afterwards, bless them, you know. Yeah,
I think you can do. So the approach I'm increasingly seeing is that you've got to build that trust, because they may not understand the methods that you're using. But if they trust you, then they allow you. So it's learning by doing, really. So basically, they allow you, they give you permission to do some work. This happened at UK Passport Office, where basically I was amazed because this was my first major business transformation program as a business architect, and Charles was there basically as well. So we go back a long time. But basically, the head of the program just gave me permission, and I thought, oh, this is good. And of course, later on, 5 years later, when I went into another organisation and I found I wasn't given any permission, it was a bit of a shock. And that's been the story mostly since then. But I was amazed, and the UK Passport Service was great because basically they just trusted me. And we went live and we had lots of problems, but it all came good in the end because the architecture was very sound. We had headlines in the Daily Mail, that sort of thing. But we were given permission, but so often you're not. So basically, you have to sort of start small and sort of get the trust, and then you can sort of make progress, I think. But quite often, they still never understand what you're doing, but they trust you and are happy about the end result. But the issue then is how you build in capability, because you're not there to be there every day. You got to build in that internal capability of the system to renew itself, to develop itself. And that is, of course, the big consultancies don't want to do that, but, personally, I do. But, to make that system self-sustaining, an adaptive, complex adaptive system, which I actually don't think human systems are myself, but if they are, they're shit at it, because basically we're destroying the planet and destroying everything around us. So how can we be classed as a complex adaptive system? I do not know, but anyway.
On that note, thank you very much for joining us, Tim.